The context here is that we've been hearing a lot about what's been going on over in Ukraine, and it turns out that the U.S. Space Force and various other official people say that Russia is engaging in jamming GPS satellite signals in Ukraine. And people may wonder what's going on here and why is it important and how does it affect military? First of all, this is what the Navstar, which is the US GPS, looks like. Ours is different from the similar setups from Russia, China, and India, in that theirs tend to be geosynchronous orbits of the satellites, whereas ours are mobile, they move. And so we have truly global coverage, not just our own territories. And that's an important difference. But it's also an important difference that makes ours more vulnerable in some ways. That's just a picture credit for Navstar, and this is one of the GPS satellites. GPS services appear to be under threat in Ukraine. Russia is jamming GPS signals in the Ukraine. Ukraine may not be able to use the GPS, at least not our GPS, according to Space Force when they spoke with NBC. And there are articles that suggest we really don't need to let ourselves and our GPS be held hostage. And that's going to be part of what I'll talk about later. The upper part of this illustration just shows generally how GPS is set up. Each satellite is continually sending out weak radio signals with its position and the exact time. I want to put an asterisk after time. Time, as Einstein reminded us, is relativistic, and these satellites are a considerable distance above the Earth. If you're going to measure, and here we get into Heisenberg, if we are going to measure time really precisely, we can get into relativistic effects where one clock isn't synchronized with another. The clock upstairs isn't synchronized with the clock downstairs. This can present interesting issues. So on Earth, a receiver will compare the time when the signal is sent with the time when it was received. This is used to calculate your exact distance from the satellite. After correcting for errors, including the relativistic error, the receiver uses the signals from 4 or more satellites to calculate its position in 3D. This is called trilateration, not triangulation. Triangulation is with cell towers on the Earth. And we'll get to the bottom half of this later. So here's a report of an incident, just to show you guys how a very cheap box can cause some very major issues. And I am going to shrink you guys. There. It was just after midday in San Diego, California, when the disruption started. In the tower at the airport, air traffic controllers peered at their monitors, only to find that their system for tracking incoming planes was malfunctioning. At the Naval Medical Center, emergency pagers used for summoning doctors stopped working. Chaos threatened the busy harbor, too, after the traffic management system there, used for guiding boats, failed. On the streets, people reaching for their cell phones found they had no signal. Bank customers trying to withdraw cash from local ATMs were refused. Problems persisted for another 2 hours. It took 3 days to find an explanation for this mysterious event in January 2007. 2 Navy ships in the San Diego harbor had been conducting a training exercise. To test procedures when communications were lost, technicians jammed radio signals. Unwittingly, they also jammed the signals from GPS satellites across a swath of the city. The problem is that the GPS signal is very weak. It's like a car headlight at, let's say, about 10,000 miles, says one of these consultants. You can't boost the signal any further because on the satellite, you can't have an onboard power supply that's powerful enough to boost the signal significantly. And here we get into the law of inverse squares that we all know from physics, where the signal will be weaker according to the square of the distance. In November 2010, A NASA-appointed executive committee for space-based positioning, navigation, and timing warned that jamming devices could cause disaster if activated in cities. It was not known how many devices were out there. It's not known now how many are out there. But the panel was concerned that the risk of interference was growing fast, and it's growing even faster now. In the future, devices called spoofers, which I'll explain later, which subtly trick GPS receivers into giving false readings, may make the problem even worse. Here's a teardown of a GPS jammer. It plugs into a cigarette lighter in a car or a truck. It has some circuitry in here, which does the dirty work, and it has an antenna, very much the same way as some routers have antennas. Only this time it's transmitting. And this is what it does. What was that? It transmits a pulse, sort of like an electromagnetic pulse or a continuous signal, which blocks the weaker signal coming from the GPS satellite. You can do this with radio frequencies. You can do it with cell phones. And it's been done to block Radio Free Europe in Eastern Europe. And it was done by Cuba to block Radio Marti under the Castro regime. So a $225 GPS spoofer can send sat-nav guided vehicles into oncoming traffic. Some restrictions apply. This is it. This is a pen, an ordinary pocket pen for size reference. A Raspberry Pi, a mobile charger, an antenna, and a device called a Hack RF1 SDR. SDR is software-defined radio. That component is illegal in the United States. It's illegal to manufacture them. It's illegal to possess them. It's illegal to use them. However, they don't come from the US. So we had, there was a fellow by the name of Todd Humphreys who did a proof of concept. He can trick you into thinking you are someplace else. He uses a spoofer device that causes GPS receivers to give an inaccurate reading. Humphrey's GPS spoofer looks like a wireless internet router on the outside. It picks up genuine GPS signals and synchronizes its output to resemble them. Any nearby receiver will treat this output as a genuine signal from a GPS satellite. The spoofer then gradually alters its time output, changing the true value by, say, 3 nanoseconds per second. Now you can see where the relativistic effects start to come in with the satellites. That's a very short period of time over a short period of time. Since GPS receivers use the time signature in a signal to find location, or as an easily accessible clock, your computer uses it for a clock, the error builds up. A GPS signal already has to be corrected for relativistic effects, and spoofing simply inserts additional corrections to mislead the detector. This could then make, for example, a missile, which is supposed to head toward the enemy, turn back toward your own cities. So how do we defend against this? A ground-based backup solution for GPS jamming. In the US, we did have it, but it was seen as a redundancy, and the government bureaucrats decided they didn't want to fund it. So we now have currently no ground-based backup system for Navstar at the moment. In Europe, these are the different countries in Europe: the British Isles, the continent, Denmark, Norway. Eventually we'll probably have Sweden in the mix, and Iceland. And you can see how you can form a network which acts just the same way that GPS does. It gives you at least 4 towers that at all times you are able to get signals from them, and thereby you can do trilateralization. There's also been some research by the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, for using radio pulses from lightning. These natural atmospheric radio sources, or spherics, have a very low frequency, so can penetrate deep underground or even underwater. The military is interested because this would improve navigation in caves and tunnels and for submarines. It's called S-Bug. GPS jamming is also used by truck and other drivers to prevent tracking of their activities while on the job. Now, this is illegal and dangerous. And here's a reference, which I will include in the chat as a PDF. You'll have all these slides. And it gives 5 common misconceptions about what GPS jamming can do for the drivers. And then it tells why what they're doing is really dangerous and really stupid. And companies can tell when you suddenly disappear from their GPS tracking. And then they're going to start asking questions. Maybe even send the cops after you. So the use of any jammer is illegal in the United States and most other countries. It is a felony to manufacture, possess, or use these devices, which is why most of the units are manufactured in China. China has a ground-based backup for their GPS system. I don't know about India, but Russia does also have a ground-based backup. Russia excels at cyber and electronic warfare. Its experts have boasted their abilities could make aircraft carriers useless. Russian forces regularly jam GPS and other satellite signals in various parts of the world. They have also perfected spoofing, the technique which sends false signals to make GPS users think they are someplace they are not. Unlike Russia, China, and some other countries, the US does not have a terrestrial system to fall back on when essential timing and navigation signals from space are not available. We had such a system, but instead of security and resilience, the bureaucrats saw unneeded duplication with GPS, and the system was shut down. Notwithstanding promises made in 2008 and 2015 to establish a land-based backup for GPS, and a 2018 law requiring one to be in operation by the end of 2020, nothing has been done. I'm not going to comment on which administration decided not to do it. The law seeking a GPS backup. A few years back, the National Timing, Resilience, and Security Act directed the Transportation Secretary to establish a land-based timing system that could serve as a backup for GPS within 2 years from that time. The deadline came and went in late 2020, but as of January of 2021, the Transportation Department did report to Congress on a roadmap to implementation that it's been following toward that goal. And here's a CNET report, which folks can look into, which tells us about all kinds of alternatives that are ground-based, including at least one which could be on every cell phone in just a few years. Ukraine was already mentioned when this article was written as a place where GPS from satellites had been jammed. This was in 2019 to 2021. Here's one possible alternative. It's NextNav from TerraPoint. This is what it looks like. It uses either cell towers or what are going to be the 5G neighborhood antennas, or something on top of a building in an urban area. All you need is 4 of these, and you can do the same kind of trilateration to get your location and to plot a route and to stay on course for navigation. You can do the same thing that you could do with the satellites, only this can operate over a very short area. It's still vulnerable to military attack, however, because these are fixed antennas. But they can be used for driverless cars. They can be used for drones. They can be used in the military for drones. And they can be used for your cell phone, and cell communications also use it. All that. And 5G cell service makes this type of option more attractive. 5G coverage isn't complete right now, but when it gets farther along, the 5G towers and antennas will make a pretty good mesh from which ground-based location calculations can be made. Shorter 5G wavelengths may make such a network more precise than was possible with 4G or 3G technologies, and you can certainly handle more signals with 5G. By the way, cell phones can be used phone to phone to create ad hoc mesh networks. Routers can be used router to router, although in the United States, there are regulatory restrictions on the power that a router can reach when it's broadcasting. So these ad hoc networks in emergencies or in war zones can operate, and the regulators aren't going to mind if you pump up the power so that you can reach farther. There are also, these networks tend to be very resilient to jamming for two reasons. One, they can use a lot of different frequencies and bands. And two, you can use frequency hopping in order to avoid being blocked on just one frequency. So there are some apps that you can use to chat and to do text. Unfortunately, you can't do data or internet just yet, where there's no internet connection and no cell service. And it's totally without a contract, and you're using a mesh network. And then there's this curious little thing called GoTenna. People use these in the wilderness when they're on hikes and stuff like that. And there are no cell towers available, no signals. And this was what was used clear up until the time when Starlink and Iridium started to be implemented. But of course, you don't have to subscribe to these very expensive services in order to use GoTenna. And GoTenna has a fair amount of range. It depends on terrain, but you can get a pretty good network, and you can stay in touch with people who are beyond your line of sight. And I'm pretty sure this can be adapted to military use. And then there's Starlink. Elon Musk's Starlink is keeping Ukrainians online when traditional internet has failed due to Russian meddling. Musk has sent terminals for the satellite internet service after a Ukrainian official tweeted at him asking what was he doing for Ukraine. So there are alternatives. And on the military side, I'm sure there's a lot more we're not being told about. So that's it for my slideshow. I will do an escape, and I will return control of the meeting back to...
So the question is, do you happen to know if they didn't use adjust for relativistic properties of time, how close would your position be?
I am pretty sure that I'm trying to get to the meeting control, the control, so I can stop sharing. I am pretty sure that there would be a significant error if the relativistic effects were not being taken into consideration. There's the stop share.
I've read in several sailing magazines where GPS is pretty important. The sailing, that it would be 3 or 4 miles. I was just wondering if that's correct or not.
I think it could easily be miles with Navstar. Right. Don't forget, they're like, what are they, 25? What are they, 25 miles up or 50 miles up? That's pretty far. And the timing is, if you have a 3 nanosecond per second difference, that could place you quite a number of feet away.
Well, because my standard rule of thumb from experimenting around on mooring is it's about 13 or 10 to 13, 14 feet typically is the error or potential error. But I've always wondered if that 3 or 4 miles is correct.
Military GPS.
I found an article on it that I'll forward to the group.
Thanks, John.
Okay.
In addition to the article that John has, I do know that it used to be that military grade GPS could locate you a lot more precisely than civilian GPS. It was, I believe, Bill Clinton's administration where they lifted that rule. However, I'm pretty sure the military has systems that are much more precise. However, they're not more resilient to jamming.
I don't think they're much more precise. I think the reason they lifted it was because there were enough people figuring out where they were by figuring out the error injected into the system, so that they were getting exact readings. And they finally said, what we're not accomplishing anything. And that's why they lifted it.
Okay, we'll go with that.
Bob, if you ever use Lorraine on a boat,
I have.
No,
But it's
Then
a
the-
cell-
Lorraine is your girlfriend. Loran is the technology.
Lorraine. Oh, you use either one. It's okay. With the Lorraine,
Yeah,
I'll
Lorraine
stick with
knows what
Lorraine. I
she's
remember
doing
Lorraine.
too.
I think I went to
Yeah.
high school with her. We used Lorraine. It was line of sight, and the towers were on land.
Yeah.
So there were great limitations. And if you talk about a Navy, well, a Navy can't use a Loran system because they're always out. If they're actually in action, they're not going to be in sight of land of their own towers. Or at least you hope they're not.
I thought
And
Loran
so-
was
Yeah.
radio. It was effective over quite long distances.
Bouncing off the ionosphere.
I don't know. Yeah, if you look at the charts and the Loran lines, they're all over the place, and they have these. They're not rectangular. It's kind of confusing to use it.
Yeah, it's not line of sight.
Yeah,
That's what I thought.
according to the article that John Rudy just referenced, at 38 microseconds per day, the relativistic offset in the rates of the satellite clocks is so large that if left uncompensated, it would cause navigational errors that accumulate faster than 10 kilometers per day, well over 5 miles, I would say. GPS accounts for relativity by electronically adjusting, etc. And there are computer chips which also do things. Without proper application of relativity, GPS would fail in its navigational functions within about 2 minutes.
Close enough.
Now, while Bob was doing all that, I went to Dr. Google and looked up Loran, and it said it's effective up to 1,500 miles.
Right, that's what I thought, because I've seen those funny lines on charts that go fairly far out.
How does it?
Yeah.
How does it do that without in daytime without bouncing off the ionosphere?
Megaphones.
There's a Wikipedia article, and I'll forward that one now also.
But it's using radio waves, and they can go a long way if they're bouncing up and down.
Yeah, but the thing is, in the daytime, you don't have reliable bouncing off the F layers.
Oh,
You have additional layers also that form the E layers.
Right. That's why at night people call into WBZ from Alabama because they're listening to it down there.
Exactly. Exactly.
this is why I used a sextant out there.
Yeah.
It's a little different at night than during the day, isn't it?
Yeah. Well,
So,
you
Bob,
know,
you raised an interesting question that maybe some of the people understand this on here can help me. We know a fair amount about frequency hopping radio transmission. Why can't GPS do the same thing so that we're not limited to the frequency, so that it can be jammed? Because that's one of the typical things. My understanding is that we use from security.
two problems. One, the crowded radio spectrum. You'd be interfering with somebody else. 5G is interfering with certain navigation systems in commercial aircraft in this country because of the band we chose. So that's one problem with frequency. Another problem is if you jam, you aren't jamming one frequency. You can do broadband jamming. Back in the early days of radio, before the Tesla device and Marconi and Edison radios, the broadcast used to be something like a K band, which was really broad and not restricted to narrow little notches. Tesla devised a device that allowed for discrete frequencies. And so then we get this frequency hopping. That's used when you have a missile that you fire or a torpedo, and you don't want the enemy to specifically block that frequency.
So why is that? Why would that be different than GPS? I mean, certainly there are got to be technologies that would defeat this. I mean, if that was the case, all radio transmissions throughout the world, military and civilian, are at risk today, right now. And why anything works is beyond me.
I have to tell you, if it's radio, if it's Wi-Fi, it can be jammed.
Oh, I understand that. I don't argue that. But the question is, why aren't the bad guys doing it, en masse, if it's such an easy thing to do?
You
know,
think they're not?
Well, I can still see the sun, so I know that frequency is not being blocked.
Retaliation. It's called retaliation.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're keeping it for a rainy day.
I would say so. After all, if somebody really wanted to do away with everything, they'd set off an electromagnetic pulse.
But that's self-destructive as well, right?
Not necessarily if they know how to shield theirs and they do it first.
If I put on my aluminum foil hat, I'll probably be okay.
Who knows? With a strong enough Faraday cage far enough under the ground, you might be safe.
Well, you better go watch Better Call Saul. You can learn a lot about aluminum hats.
Of course you can. They come in different designs too. I happen to like the tricorn version. It's really nice.
One thing about GPS is the GPS satellites are an altitude of 20,000 miles. So
Yeah.
by the time the signal gets to the Earth, it's very weak, probably compared to all other signals, and somewhat easy to jam.
Yeah, that's the 20,000 miles of the geosynchronous orbit, right?
Yes, near geosynchronous. They may actually orbit twice in a day.
Yeah, ours are mobile. India and China have geosynchronous.